Welcome to the Positive Universal Project. 2023 will make it 10 years since Sarah Ritter and I published an article that we titled The Market, Multiculturalism, and Light Culture, Responding to Žižek's Challenge. What was that challenge? How did we respond to it? Well, we responded with a lot of words. For my part, however, I can't speak for Sarah. Those words meant the world to me. I meant every one of them, and I still mean them more than ever. In writing my part of that piece, I personally accepted Žižek's challenge of taking on a project that he spends very little time describing, even though he's been alluding to it by name since at least 2011. What he has said about it, however, has been enough to inspire me and at the same time humble me, frighten me, terrify me when I contemplate the enormity and the complexity of the project that he's proposing. I was a first-generation college student, so I know what's now called the imposter syndrome. I know it because I lived it. Lived? Hell, I live it now. People like me, people from lower income, working class backgrounds, don't go to college. And we damn sure don't go on to complete doctoral programs and become college professors and get to meet and interact with an intellectual of Žižek's caliber. The best way to describe the imposter syndrome is to say that it's a feeling, or maybe an awareness, that you don't really belong somewhere. It can, in the case of Žižek's proposed project, it has made me question my ability to carry this project forward in the way that it needs to move forward. Nevertheless, I've been obsessed with it since 2013 when Sarah and I wrote our article, and I've dedicated 100% of my research time to the reading of books from a multitude of different disciplines and fields. Contemporary ones, ancient ones, everything. I've been reading anything and everything I could that I thought would help me think through my thoughts on what Žižek's project might look like and how it should get started, as well as my thoughts on what I might contribute to that end. I've struggled with these questions over the past 10 years, but my imposter syndrome denied me the confidence to even attempt it. It's been a real obstacle, and it's taken a lot of work to strengthen my will to the point where I could conquer it. But I've put in that work, I've put in that time, and I've made this, sharing my thoughts on Žižek's proposed project and the questions it raises for me when thinking about the direction it should take, my life's work. In doing so, I'm aware that I'm making it my project. Of course, I want to remain faithful to the broad designs of Žižek's vision that originally inspired me. But I know it's unavoidable that the questions I want to raise around the project will be my questions. And whatever thoughts I share on those questions will be my thoughts. There's no avoiding that, it just is. But I'm not launching this project with the thought of it ever achieving its yet to be fully defined desired ends in my own lifetime. I'm not pretending to know all the answers to all the questions I can think to raise about it. I don't even pretend to know all the questions we need to ask, or if I'm even raising the right ones. All I hope to accomplish is to start a conversation around the questions that Žižek's project demands answers to. So let's get on with it. There are at least two ways to introduce you to Žižek's proposed project. One of those ways passes through Zuccotti Park, the Occupy Wall Street protest of 2011, and a rather funny novelty t-shirt that Žižek has been known to wear. That t-shirt, in case you want to order one for yourself, and I have, comes from Melville House, and it displays the line from Herman Melville's Bartleby the Scrivener. Whenever his employer gave him a directive, Bartleby would always reply with, "I would prefer not to." And Žižek references that line from Melville when describing the Occupy Wall Street movement, stating that we should read Occupy as a clear signal that a sizable number of people would prefer not to live under the tyranny of global capitalism. But that same sizable number of people, as Žižek observes, don't have an answer to the question of what they would prefer. And that's his challenge, to find an answer to that question. What would we prefer over global capitalism, or better and more completely, If we genuinely would prefer not to live under the tyranny of global capitalism, what should we prefer over it? That's the question, in my view, that drives Žižek's proposed project. What should we prefer over global capitalism? The second way to introduce you to the project is a bit more involved, but gives us deeper insights into what Žižek means for this project to accomplish, and a greater sense of its gravity. It starts with Žižek's account of European reactions to the massive numbers of North African and Middle Eastern refugees entering Europe in 2013. And he identifies two dominant reactions coming from opposite ends of the political spectrum. The left wants open borders, allowing all migrants to enter freely. The right wants to close all borders, allowing no one to enter, period. Žižek characterizes this as a double blackmail, which we can define as any situation where we find ourselves presented with two options. And as Žižek says, quoting Stalin, both options are worse. Our proper aim, he argues, should be to try and reconstruct global society on such a basis that desperate refugees will no longer be forced to wander around. Utopian as it may appear, he says, this large-scale solution is the only realist one, and the display of altruistic virtues ultimately prevents the carrying out of this aim. The more we treat refugees as objects of humanitarian help and allow the situation which compelled them to leave their countries to prevail, the more they come to Europe, until tensions reach boiling point, not only in the refugees' countries of origin, but here as well. So, confronted with this double blackmail, Žižek says, we are back at the great Leninist question, what is to be done? A little later in the text, he answers his own question. The only way to break out of this deadlock is to move beyond mere tolerance of others. Don't just respect others, offer them a common struggle, since our problems today are common. Propose and fight for a positive, universal project shared by all participants. That's the project. That's Žižek's challenge, to which Sarah and I responded, the positive, universal project. What has Žižek told us about it? What we've already learned is that it's driven by the question of what model of civilization should we prefer over global capitalism. And that question begs the prior question of why we would prefer not to live under global capitalism. We can find the short answer to that in Žižek's assertion that our problems today are common. And the reason why they're common is because those problems all stem from the conditions and relations imposed on us by global capitalism. Only when we replace global capitalism with a model of civilization that we would prefer will we ever be able to, quote, reconstruct global society on such a basis that desperate refugees will no longer be forced to wander around. But to do that, we must know what we would prefer, or again, what we should prefer. Those are two different questions, and the difference is actually very important. Our preferences are always shaped by what we know and what we know to value. I'm not talking only about what we explicitly know. I'm talking mainly about what we implicitly know that secretly informs our preferences. So to ask what would we prefer over global capitalism runs the risk of having us decide our preferences without questioning our basis or deciding on those preferences. That decision might be based on wrong assumptions. How much has global capitalism shaped what we know and what we know to value? How much has it shaped what we don't know and what we don't value? How might that knowledge subliminally shape what we would presume to prefer? Shifting to the normative question, what should we prefer over global capitalism, helps us gain some critical distance from what we would prefer. Helps us gain some critical distance from what we know and from what we know to value. It asks us to question what we think we would prefer, what we think we know to value. And it forces us to confront another prior set of questions. Not only should we ask ourselves what we should prefer over global capitalism, we should also ask ourselves about what we should know and what we should know to value in order to best know what we should prefer over global capitalism. So in sum, precisely because they're framed in normative terms, these questions provide the positivity of the positive universal project. What should we know in order to best know what we should know to prefer over global capitalism? What should we know to value in order to best know what we should know to prefer over global capitalism? Those are the two questions that provides the project with its positivity. What provides it with its universality, as far as I'm concerned, lies in its species level of openness as an invitation to everyone, anyone who wants to contribute to the conversation around those or other relevant questions. The internet goes a long way toward making this kind of universal conversation possible, though I do recognize that there are limits, most of them being either linguistic or logistical, to this universality. Hopefully, we can find ways to use technology to overcome the linguistic limitations. I can't think of ways to realistically address the logistical problem of there not being universal access to the technology. But we're a long way from having to concern ourselves with those issues. Setting those issues aside, I hope you can understand why I might have lacked the confidence to take on a task as monumental as the Positive Universal Project. We can call it PUP for short. In my view, PUP represents the greatest challenge to our capacity for collective learning that our species has ever faced. For the past 35 years, I've studied and taught in colleges of education. Those colleges profit heavily from their narrow definition of education. Programmatically, their curricula are primarily dedicated to the preparation of teachers to serve the human capital needs of the state's system of compulsory schooling. As the population increases, the demand increases for schools and therefore for teachers. So it's easy to understand why colleges of education might as well be called colleges of compulsory schooling. Their definition of education conflates it with compulsory schooling. And the focus of my scholarly work has always been much broader than that. I used to hate having to use the word education. Most people always assumed I was talking about compulsory schools. And sometimes I was, but sometimes I wasn't. And when I wasn't, I didn't have an alternative phrase to use. Shortly after moving to Idaho in 2013, however, I discovered one that originated in the multidisciplinary field of big history and the work of David Christian. It was Christian's book, Maps of Time, that introduced me to the idea of collective learning. For him, the uniqueness of our capacities for collective learning accounts for our dominance as a species. He describes us as the most dominant species in the history of this planet. But the capacity for symbolic thought that laid the foundation for our capacity for speech, language, art, and later written language gave us tremendous abilities to share, revise, and build upon knowledge and ideas transgenerationally and across great distances. Later technological innovations such as the printing press, radio, television, and most recently the internet enhanced our capacities for collective learning further still, and to the point that makes this universal conversation possible. And it's hugely important for us to recognize PUP as an exercise in collective learning that is open to everyone. No single one of us knows enough to know all these questions we need to ask as we consider what we should prefer over global capitalism, let alone the answers to those questions. We need to understand the search for those questions and their answers as the common struggle referenced earlier by Žižek. For these reasons and many more, I'm most grateful to be joined by Kylie Stedman Gomes, who knows many questions that I do not know to ask, and that may have more immediate application to our efforts toward removing ourselves from the abuses and tyranny of global capitalism. So with that, I will turn things over to Kylie. Thank you.
So we started off reading the Žižek Against the Double Blackmail book, and then followed our noses essentially to another 3 books. These were Elinor Ostrom's Governing the Commons, Renee Girard's The Scapegoat, and Paul Levy's Wetiko. Ostrom had 8 principles for governing the commons, and there were 2 particularly pertinent to what we're looking at. The first of these was to define clear group boundaries, and the second one is about matching the rules governing the use of commons goods to local needs and conditions. The scapegoat, there are 2 key ideas in this. The first one is around mimetic desire. So when people have already got their biological needs met, we tend to look to each other or to what other people seem to desire to figure out what we want for ourselves. And because then you've got everyone looking for the same thing, so the resource or the desired object becomes scarce, there's then rivalry for that, for access or ownership of that object, and then that leads to conflict. So the scapegoat aspect is that in order to resolve the chaos that comes from this conflict of chasing after the limited object of desire, a community that has been descended into chaos identifies a scapegoat, whether it's a person or another small group, as being the source of the problem that they're experiencing, and comes together to, as a group, either eliminate or expel the scapegoat. Wetiko is one of the American indigenous names for an evil cannibalistic spirit, or a mind virus, as Paul Levy calls it, that when we're blind to it leads us into destructive selfishness, consumption, and insatiable greed. It's the selfishness, it's the not looking outside of one's own desires and needs, and is putting them above everything else. There were some themes that seemed very relevant to Žižek's call for a positive universal project. The way that we've managed our boundaries, or if you look specifically at the refugee issue, borders, the technologies, the approaches, the processes that we use, they don't work anymore. So we need new ones. And each of these books in some ways were dealing with that question of boundaries. What we particularly ended up focusing on for the Positive Universal Project was that question of what we should bring in or push out, what should be externalized, which we might consider a curation process. So historically, we have simply, gone for the maximum power principle to put in the least amount of effort and get the most benefit out of it. We have tended to externalize costs to the outside of the groups we identify with and retain as many of the benefits as we can. We feel that this is not only true of those material resources, but also the psychological costs of the efforts of thinking. What we do, again, saving energy, has typically been like a very simple binary in the terms of, do we keep it in or do we throw it out? Is it us or is it them? Do we include it or do we exclude it? And if there is only, one center of power, if you're only thinking about like one tribe, or one village, one community, then this can seem to work very well, because the people that are scapegoated, or the external environment doesn't have much voice. It's effectively invisible. So the community gets the benefits out of it, and no one really kicks up that much of a fuss. However, today we've got multiple centers of power, and so what happens is, they kind of push against each other, because when they're pushing something outside of themselves and blaming the other group is just as big and just as powerful, and it pushes back. So you kind of end up with this back and forth escalating backlash, or which we sort of tend to refer to as polarization. So our suggestion is perhaps to look to the natural world and mimic the strategies that it uses, of thinking of boundaries as membranes, so semi-permeable, that there are conditions on what comes in and what goes out, in part according to what's internal, part according to what's external, and it's really very, very context driven. So another theme that came up was around the things that we have in common, and what the underlying values are. Whether you open your borders to anybody, or shut them completely, which is double blackmail things that Žižek was pointing out. The real difference is around how we manage the situation. It's not necessarily arguing about what the underlying values are. Perhaps you might have the shared values of not only community security, but also looking out for each other as human beings more generally. But we weigh them up differently. So these are questions of how you achieve what's needed rather than necessarily about the values themselves. So that term double blackmail, maybe worth pointing out here, is really, it's another way of describing what is also known as a double bind or a multipolar trap. Neither approach, neither closing the borders or opening the borders, without thinking about any further, can actually deal with that common problem that we've got. We tend to think of controlling borders around the laws. Laws don't really stand by themselves. That they're not something that just exists. They're a social contract. It's based on a commons of what people all believe in common. So if a law is not actually accepted or trusted by the people that it applies to, then it effectively has no power because no one's going to actually follow it. So the cultural substrate that we have, the things that we actually believe in together, so cultural values, we really need a way to protect and nurture that substrate. This means excluding cultural values that are incompatible and would disrupt the substrate that exists, but also at the same time including nurturing and compatible values. In democracies in particular, we've become very much accustomed to just relying on votes for, sometimes against, but mostly for some sort of pre-bundled solution, rather than thinking through the actual essence of the problems for ourselves. This is because when we're voting, this is actually really the only power that we have. If you've only got a choice between two things, then you're going to stick fairly firmly to the one that you feel is that you agree with. This pre-bundled approach can become a very serious issue when we're dealing with the more complex situations, such as the climate migration, because any response that is actually likely to be effective for everybody is not going to be able to be easily explained or understood. And the pre-bundled solutions that are offered that we get to vote on are oversimplified, and regardless of which one we choose, it's basically going to be ineffective. So open borders completely are ineffective, closed borders completely are ineffective. It's the process itself that we need to change. If we look at it again as a semi-permeable membrane, not just what's inside and outside, but what decides what's inside and what's outside, in order to have or to create membranes that are actually capable of filtering and organizing, we need to start with the problem and not the solution. The third theme is around power. We are able to direct our power at the moment towards these prepackaged solutions, and none of those prepackaged solutions are effective, which I think effectively makes us feel like we're powerless, and to look to others to see where power might be. It's not that we don't have power ourselves, however. It's that the decision-making structures that we use actually channel all of our power towards extremely limited options. And when the options are that limited, you end up with poles of power that concentrate around those limited options, and one of them is going to win out over the other. A lot of our power is actually getting submerged. It's going sort of under the surface where we can't see it. So we lose our awareness of our own power, and also a sense of responsibility towards it. When we have power, we know it's important to use it ethically and wisely. However, if we feel that we don't have any power, then you don't necessarily see a need to use it ethically or wisely in yourself. Instead, we look to whoever else we regard as being an authority and expect them to do it instead. So responding appropriately to the predicaments that we're facing, such as this climate forced migration and the meta crisis that we have, requires us to fully confront and actually consider issues like this head on, to actually look at the problem. Another way of looking at this is that our tendency to sort of point the fingers and blame each other has us trapped in something of a drama triangle we used to it in psychology, of the victim, the perpetrator, and the rescuer. One of the things that Žižek points out in his book is that we are actually all strangers to each other. It's like we can't say that we're all human and therefore we're all the same. Yes, we have the same biological needs, the air, food, water, shelter, but but we don't actually all have the same values. And where our values differ, it causes conflict. When people do share values, there's sort of a culture that sort of gets created around that. Because there is agreement on what's most important, it becomes, the power of all the people who are actually in that culture can sort of come together and be directed in a single direction, to meet the agreed common needs of the people in that culture. Those shared values are really, what I would call an invisible substrate, so an invisible foundation for that culture. When we think of culture in general, we do tend to think about, the visible, or what you might call the directly experiential aspects, so things like the different foods, the clothes, the art, music. We can't experience the underlying values. So even though those underlying shared values are the substrate, it is actually the thing that people have in common. It's basically like the part of the iceberg that's underwater. And we can feel it there. Like it can make us feel uncomfortable or suspicious about what's going on, because there's a sense of the values not being shared, but we don't know really what they are. But I don't think everything is lost. We can take some of these things that are currently invisible and bring them to the surface. If we can pick out the values that are the most important to forming a culture, and the ones that are really not negotiable for people, and match those so that the new people coming into a culture actually have the same, not all values, but the most important values in common with the people that they're going to be moving and having as new neighbors, then this should actually reduce some conflict. Because even though we can't see what those values are, if they are actually matched, then we're probably going to feel a little less uncomfortable in general, especially if we know that we've gone through that matching process. So by doing this, we would effectively be creating a sort of a semi-permeable membrane. Overall, just knowing that these values are held in common, these most important values, it promotes trust. Needs need to be prioritized over desires at all times. There's no hard and fast rule as to whether something is a need or something is a desire. Context is essentially everything. We need to have a common or a universal sort of protocol or principle that follows this principle of prioritizing the meeting of needs above desires always, but without trying to dictate how those needs will be met. We've got a 2-month-old baby girl on the left and a 20-year-old man on the right. Now they both share this abstract biological need for food, but the specifics of what food, the quantity of it, and the frequency, that it needs to be ingested are very different for these two. So let's say that these are the only 2 foods available at all, right? And this baby's mother can actually breastfeed her. Then the ice cream for the 20-year-old man, if that is the only food that's around, even though it may not be nutritionally very good, is actually a need, whereas the formula is not. So the protocol, or this, the principle or the universal protocol that we're looking for, it actually applies to the contextual relationship that's necessary for meeting needs or meeting desires. It doesn't apply to the person. So we're not going baby more important than adult, and we're not saying, well, female more or less important than male or anything like that. And it doesn't apply to what we might think of as the solution object, which is, the formula versus the ice cream. It's actually in the full context being taken into account all at once, or that contextual relationship. Yeah. So that's what this principle of Ostrom's is about. So governing the use of commons goods, in this case, it would be the money to buy one of these things, and matching to local needs and conditions. And local in this case is not about a geographic place, but it is about the scope of the problem that we're looking at, which in this case is around feeding, or meeting the food needs of baby and men. Any effective universal protocols are actually universalizing the means of coming to agreement rather than the ends of the agreement. So remember, the open borders, closed borders, that's like an end of the agreement, if that makes sense. It's not the means by which we get there. So for the refugee issue, I would suggest, and this is only a suggestion, that we might start looking from the perspective of countries and looking at their laws, because we can assume that the laws of a country are going to apply equally to every citizen, whether they're old or new. But what we can't do is assume that every single one of the laws is going to be equally valuable. And there's also the considering the rights and responsibilities, which always need to be balanced. So from the perspective of the refugees, that they should have, in this suggestion anyway, they should have the right to define their own core values for their culture or for themselves personally, and the responsibility that they will have is that wherever they're placed, that they will need to obey the laws of the new country that they move to. The places that are going to accept refugees will have, should have the right to determine how many placements they can make available and whereabouts in their country those are available. They would have the right to define their core values as boundary or membrane conditions for any newcomers to meet in order to be able to come in. The countries have the responsibility to uphold the laws equally, regardless of whether the citizens in question are new or old. And also they will have some sort of responsibility to integrate any new citizens. So just going back to the scapegoat again, once basic needs are met, we look to others and desire what others want. This is a tendency in human beings that it is unrealistic to think that we can actually change about ourselves. That's part of us being social. It's part of how we learn. So it's there to stay. And it's something that we therefore really need to take into consideration when we're trying to solve a problem like this. And obviously, some of these placements, regardless of value matching, are going to be more desirable from the perspective of refugees than others. If people want to go to a particular country, then they may actually lie about their own values in order to be matched with a country that they think is more appealing. Sortition is the action of selecting or determining something by the casting or drawing of lots. A good example of this is jury selection. There's a pool of people who have met conditions already, and then they are selected at random. Getting this balance of how much of a role chance should play, getting that right in governance isn't easy. Whenever time matters, a random selection is going to be much faster than a process of going through and trying to weigh up pros and cons for each person. The idea of how this would work is that all of the placements that match values, you can throw all of those placements for all of those countries sort of into the hat and then select at random. So people don't know which particular country they're going to end up in, which means that competition is kind of beside the point. Merely making it a lottery doesn't actually change the landscape of outcomes. So you still would have some places that are highly desirable and some others that really aren't. If all of the money is actually pooled into like a resettlement fund and associated with each refugee, regardless of which country they end up in, then this should balance out the pros and the cons a bit. Maybe it also goes some way towards improving climate justice a bit, not only for the refugees, but also for the host countries. This is a predicament. This isn't intended as a suggestion that all problems are solved. Really, all this is about is trying to look at things in perhaps a different way. It's a suggested way to start thinking about it.